We are about 68 who registered for this session. Welcome and thank you for joining us here in the room as well as online. There are a lot of people calling from around the world to discuss this important subject of navigating change, the transition from political missions and peacekeeping operations. It's great to have such a wide range of interests, of course, in this subject. I know yesterday it has been discussed about the use of armed escorts, and the subject was already a little bit introduced. But of course, the interest is there for, given the recent history of missions that have been withdrawn or drawn down. Transition is defined in the policy on integrated assessment and planning approved by the Executive Committee on 8 February 2023 as a strategic process aimed at reconfiguring the UN strategy, presence, and capacity to support peace building and sustainable peace, emphasizing national ownership, aligning with the host state's priorities and needs, and involving local communities and civil societies, while also ensuring inclusive participation of women, youth, and persons with disabilities, among other stakeholders. In the context of these transitions, we will explore the challenges and opportunities that arise for humanitarian security as peace operations are drawn down and withdrawn from potentially still fragile environments. I'm Gabriel Kamara, Senior Field Security Officer at UNHCR, and I have the privilege to be today's moderator for this session. Whether due to security improvements, Security Council's recognition of sufficient progress made towards peace and stability, the withdrawal of host government consent, or other political and security developments, mission transitions and closures remain critical phases with significant complexities, including from the perspective of humanitarian security. Our panel today brings together a wealth of experience in peacekeeping and political missions, humanitarian assistance, and security management. We are excited, very excited from hearing from them as we dive into this crucial topic. The panel discussion will last approximately 1 hour. We'll have around 20 minutes Q&A. The panel is ongoing. Please add your question to the Q&A and we'll address them at the end. For participants in the room, you can also raise your hand and we'll be able to address those questions. We look forward for an enriching discussion ahead. But before we start the discussion, I want to introduce our esteemed expert panel members. I'll start by Julie Dunphy, the head of Field Security Service at UNHCR. And online also, we do have Luc Van Dam. Luc is the director of the Office of Staff Safety and Security at IOM. Hello, Luc.
Hello.
We do also have still online Ben Hunter, regional analyst for Horn of Africa at INSO. Hi, Ben. We have Anne Carlson that you may have seen yesterday already in the panel of armed conflict. Anne is the Deputy Principal Security Coordinator at UNICEF. Hi, Anne. We have Valentin Aldea, Senior Political Affairs Officer at DPPA, the Department of Peacebuilding and Political Affairs. Hi, Valentin. Emmanuel Fanta, last but not least, a Senior Security Focal Point for support to field missions at UNDSS. Nice to have you, Emmanuel. So that's a very rich panel, and we'll start by the discussion, by first question to you, Valentine online, talking about the political aspects of the transitions. Could you please explain the typical phases involved in a transition from peacekeeping missions or special political missions? How do missions actually plan for this?
Thank you so much for the opportunity, and I'm very happy to join you and having us. I think this is an important topic that actually consumes a lot of effort and time on both sides, so to speak, either on the mission side, mission that is leaving and perhaps reconfiguring, and of course on the humanitarian and development side of the UN. I will start with some more perhaps generic remarks and then going in a bit mindful of time into some items that should be considered in the transition process. And this process should be understood as a phased moving process that starts with what is called the early transition. And it might appear counterintuitive, but the early transition planning should start at the moment the mission is finished its setup. So it's essentially that transition thinking should not start at the end, on the life end of the mission, but at the very beginning. And oftentimes we see that being a challenge because it's hard to emphasize, to foresee the end of a mission when it was just set up. So but the active part of the transition starts or commence either upon a mandate of the Security Council, and here I want to mention that most of missions would be set up by the Security Council through mandate conferred to them, but there are very few exceptions of missions that are set up by the General Assembly. So I would refer to the Security Council for the simplifying the discussion. So the mission would commence transition based on a request from the Security Council and can do so as well at the request of the host country. And we have examples currently, for example, the UNAMI, the United Nations mission in Iraq, commenced transition after the host country requested the Security Council to initiate it. So, but the decision or determination of how the transition is configured is in large measure left at the discretion of UN senior managers. And then when it comes to senior managers, I'm referring to most senior level in the UN, and then that is exemplified by the transition directive that is signed off by the Secretary General. So it starts from that level and then continues downwards with various elements for implementation. I would want to mention as well that for the purpose of our discussion, we are talking about transition of missions whereby current missions are actually either leaving, put it out that way, or reducing their presence. And those missions that we're looking at are those that are operating in an integrated fashion with the UN agencies, funds, and programs. As you perhaps most of you know, there are two principled approaches when it comes to missions. One is that of the non-integrated setting. That would be the case of small missions, special envoys, and then so on. And the other one would be the integrated context, whereby a large mission is established, and then the UN country team works together in a synchronized fashion with the mission. The mission being led as well by a deputy SRSG triple-hatted RCSHC. So going back to the proactive planning and the initiation or the transition planning from the moment the mission finished its setup is a key. It's a key element, a key point that has to be, looked at, and many lessons learned are actually drawn upon. Perhaps in most cases, not inability of initiating that transition planning as discussed. Some elements of early transition planning should include and should be based on the articulation of a joint vision on the most critical transition priorities. The mission would have a set of priorities whereas the agencies, funds, and programs working together with the mission would have some other transition priorities. So establishing a common vision would be key for a smooth transition process. That joint vision should include as well human rights considerations and protection and gender sensitive analysis that need to be addressed both by the UN and the host government in order to sustain process and retain and amplify the gains in terms of peace and security, as well as development during missions presence. The identification of those priorities would be come up through essentially two tracks. One would be the external track, including the host country, the engagement with host country and other actors outside of the UN. And that would inform a second track, which is the internal consultation within the UN between the mission, various substantive parts of the mission, and other UNSMS organizations. In this process is essential to identify the pillars that around which the transition is built, and that includes, because we are in the discussing security and safety, that should include, besides the substantive part, should include as well the enabling elements, and I include here security, logistics, every other thing that during the presence of the mission is taken for granted and in some way or another are going to be either left behind or will disappear or will transition into something new. One last small comment, and this is based on what we see again and again, there's a tendency to focus on the liquidation of the mission. And this is a very narrow approach. The preparation and the transition planning should go well beyond the liquidation. That should set the stage for the remaining organizations of the UN system to conduct their operations, implementation of mandates in respect to addressing critical humanitarian development priorities before the mission closure, but then as well after. And when I think there is an innate or natural tendency to, when planning for something, to look at the end result, which is absolutely fine because that's supposed to guide the process. But one of the most difficult part of the planning is exactly the transition part, which includes all those areas that have to be considered. So I'll stop here for now. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valentin. You talked about transition planning and all the requirements that must go into it, the consultations, the discussion within and outside of the mission. But I just want to turn to Luke and ask him ask you, Luke, how does security intersect with mission drawdown in particular, and what key considerations or planning steps should be taken into account during this process from your perspective? Over.
Yeah, thank you very much. And as already eloquently explained by my colleague Valentin, amongst others, security plays a crucial role in the mission drawdown or transition process, and several key considerations and planning steps should therefore be considered to ensure a smooth and secure transition. First, transitions are, and that was also already explained by Valentin, are a complicated process and are often influenced by national and international political considerations. Its timeline and scale often change, so we need to be aware of that. The security environment during and post-transition is often unclear or keeps changing, so proper planning is required. To adequately prepare the country team, so the agency funds and programs for smooth UN humanitarian development operations post-transition, integrated planning must be institutionalized. And in this connection, consideration should be given to appointing a UN transition coordinator as a bridge to ensure integration of security considerations in all the phases of the transition process. This approach may also help limit a siloed approach and enhance information sharing, knowledge transfer where necessary and needed, and enable early adoption of a UN country team humanitarian posture. This also includes adopting a multidisciplinary approach. Transition planning should involve key components from both the UN country team and the mission, as well as interface with the host government and political level. This includes involving representatives from logistics, security, medical, and other relevant sectors. Lastly, the interagency security management network should be consulted, and an interagency and multidisciplinary security support mission should be considered to the country to assess risks, needs, and opportunities. I hand it back over to you for the next speaker.
Thank you, Luke. It's well noted regarding all the different components, the institutionalization of the planning, the information sharing, among other things. And we know that generally during these missions, we have some capacities regarding analysis with the JMAC, with JOG, etc., that will be lost. But before talking about those capacities, I just want to turn to Anne and trying to know how crucial and why is it actually that we need to understand and analyze the context in the lead up to those mission withdrawals, taking a step backward. Over.
Thanks, Gabriel, for the question, and thank you for having me on the panel today. I think this goes back to both Valentin and Luke mentioned the importance of planning for the transition. Luke also mentioned that it is a volatile, sometimes very rapidly changing context. So analysis is a crucial step to inform your planning. Analysis of the context is a crucial step for decision-making, right? Decision makers, colleagues who are working on the planning really need scenarios so that they can advise for during the transition and after, right? Some of the key components of that are your stakeholder mapping, your access mapping. With the mission leaving or a mission significantly changing, how does that impact conflict dynamics? What do we expect could happen? The political dynamics, how does that change that? And importantly, from the humanitarian perspective, what are communities' perceptions of the UN? How are they tied to the mission or not? And how can we work on our access and acceptance strategies as a security risk management measure to carry on enabling programs? I think it's really crucial to have this analysis specifically on the security side to inform updated security risk assessments and security risk management documents, as we call them, for during the transition for after the transition. They inform our security plans, what our security posture will be afterwards. And these times are also an opportunity. So having this potential, these scenarios, this analysis is an opportunity to re-engage with the humanitarian country team, our partners, and relook at how we operate and how we support the communities in need in that country or area. Thanks, Gabriel. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Anne. I'd like to hear from INSO. We've been talking about UN context and the mission drawing down and the necessity to go to consult internal to the mission, but also with the UN country team. But Ben, I just wanted to know, what is INSO's current analysis on the general implications of drawdowns and transition in the environments in which we operate?
Sure, thanks. Thanks for having me on. I think the first thing to say from an NGO INSO perspective is that NGOs are definitely less affected than the UN in terms of their ability to stay and deliver and to carry on delivering humanitarian aid. That's because, just for simple reasons, that NGOs tend to be less integrated into the political and security structure of the mission. If anything, they seek to avoid not being integrated. I think generally, the first thing I would say is it's really area specific in each country, and not just specific to the country, but within each specific country. So the main context that I'm personally working on at the moment is related to the ATMIS AU SOM transition in Somalia, which is obviously sort of an AU context. But I mean, in Somalia, the African Union troops have adopted a very passive stance. They pretty much just hold specific towns. So in that case, there are a number of areas where the implications really aren't very big for NGOs because they don't really rely on these African Union troops to do a lot. However, there are other areas where the implications are significant, particularly if we're talking about loss of specific towns where NGOs sort of have headquarters in. And obviously for the UN, from an escort perspective, compound protection perspective, it's more significant. I think the second thing I'd say from a general perspective is definitely, given the increasing fragmentation of regional politics, you see this a lot in Somalia, but I think this also applies to DRC and other areas, is that these transitions end up being sort of really ensnared into the broader politics of the region and start causing big political delays to the implementation. So I think that's definitely a general conclusion I think we can say is ongoing. I believe that's the case in Mali, definitely the case in Somalia, with the Ethiopia-Somalia tensions over the last year with regards to the AU mission. So I think I'd sort of say those 2 points. Number one, we really have to, as Anne said, analysis is so important on this because you have to really dial down into the town district level to really understand the implications of drawdowns. At the same time, when you step back up and you look broader, I think we can say, growing political fragmentation, growing geopolitical contestation, these are really making transitions more difficult. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ben. Very interesting insights, actually. You talked about, and Anne also talked about perception. Luke did also. I want to turn to Emmanuel and ask this question: what are the implications, actually, of community perception and humanitarian access that has been also talked about following the withdrawal of a mission? And how can these perceptions impact long-term stability and trust in both national and international actors from the perspective of UNDSS and support?
Yes, thank you, Jibril. I think first, it's important to underline the fact that no transition is like another. We've had in the past several missions that have closed and where the UN peacekeeping or special political mission have been able to draw down, in a situation where we feel the overall situation or the end state of that mission when it was set up has been achieved. And so in that case, the community perception and in terms of humanitarian access, these are already taken into account when the mission draws down. I'm thinking that was the case as, for example, the mission in Côte d'Ivoire, in Timor, or in Liberia. So we had conditions where we felt the mission is in a situation where it can draw down and the UNCT and the humanitarian actors have the possibility to take over some of the remaining tasks. The challenge is more what we face now with what we would call accelerated transitions, where not necessarily all the conditions we would expect are there. And so that's really where we see that, it can be problematic, especially in terms of the community perception. So it is something that we have to be very careful in terms of also mitigating the risks that communities would feel abandoned when the mission leaves. And it's not just when the mission leaves the country, it's also a gradual process. Like, as we are closing some bases, think, for example, the POC sites in South Sudan, if we close that, what happens to the communities that were there? So it is something that we really need to take into account and make sure that we can reassure the stakeholders, reassure these communities that it's not an abandonment, and that there are other people that are there and that we can still provide some support to them. So it's really important that we take that into account. And then also, for more on the humanitarian access, it is something also that we have to be careful. It has been mentioned before, and that's maybe a bit more for the peacekeeping missions. But if you don't have the troops to provide escorts or things like that, we also have to see how it is possible to still negotiate and to ensure that there is humanitarian access and humanitarian aid that can be delivered. That can imply also rethinking the way that it's delivered. Looking at it from a security perspective is like, how can we make sure that it is delivered without endangering our staff, but also the people receiving that aid. Just to mention also, one of the, in terms of perceptions, one of the challenges that we see that is more recent, I would say, is also related to mis and disinformation. We have cases where we know that there's been attacks directed against some missions, and that also affects very much the community perception. And again, going back to the point that no one mission is like the other, we have to see also whether these attacks or whether the perception is focused on the mission or whether it's the UN as a whole. Just comparing, for example, two examples. The case in Mali. In Mali, we know that the mission was targeted, the UN country team, the humanitarian community, less so. In Somalia, it's not the case. We've had already attacks against colleagues from the agencies, funds, and programs, and against the missions there. So it's also something that we have to take really into account. And just a final point also on the perception and getting the trust of the national and international community. It goes back to this point that, whether the drawdown happens when the mission has reached its end state and whether the conditions are actually there when the mission leaves, because the biggest risk, or one of the biggest risks at least, is that some of the root causes have not been addressed. And so that there is a risk of relapse of the conflict, of the security, again, deteriorating after the mission has left. And, that affects the credibility of the UN and of the international community also in addressing the conflicts or a security situation. So I think this is some of the important points that we really think and try to take into account also in the planning of transitions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. After this, we started to look into the challenges that we face in terms of humanitarian security in this transition period. And I want to turn to Julie and ask her, what are some of the other key challenges from your perspective that you see can arrive and do arise during this period? What happens actually when the services are withdrawn? How can these gaps be addressed in a way that ensures ongoing security and humanitarian support, and maybe also, just like you mentioned just right now, Emmanuel, sustainability of what the mission has been realizing, so to say. Over.
Thank you, Jibril, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening, colleagues. Great to be back here at HNPW again. So, yeah, an interesting question. And as we were thinking about this topic and looking back at some of the missions where we've had drawdowns already and what were the challenges that we faced, I think one of the things from our perspective is the vacuum that it leaves. We become rather reliant or dependent on missions, particularly where they've been in situ for a long number of years. And I suppose we take the services and the support structures that they have for granted. Now, I think what's important to recognize here is that we're just talking about the security components and the related risk management measures around that. So there as has been mentioned already, both by Valentin and Emmanuel in their interventions, there's also elements around protection of civilians, and those, we're not touching on that during this discussion, but focusing really on the security aspects. So as I was thinking, through the topics that we're talking about here today, I think from my side, we tend to look at it, well, the transition, the drawdown is going to happen on X date, and that's maybe a year, 2 years away. So we have a long time to prepare. But as we know, this actually starts much earlier. And we really have to think that drawdown and transition at least starts a year in advance. And we have to start preparing from that stage, because once the mission starts their drawdown and transition, those services may not be available. They may not be able to provide those escorts because they're focusing now on reducing their capacity. They're focusing on their assets, and they don't have the capacity, whether it's to support us in escorts, support us in providing medical support services. These abilities are gone. What I think is important, though, that we again look at is, going back to the points made earlier by Luke, is looking at our security management structure and what that really means for us. So again, when you think about it from a practical perspective, when we establish office presence in many locations, it is usually in close proximity or where the mission can support us to be able to react and respond, or they provide security evacuation support, or they provide shelter-in-place facilities. These are things that we have to now stand up. And as many of us know, it takes time to get in the equipment, it takes time to get in bunkers, it takes time to build a safe room, and these are things that we have to consider. We also have to make sure that we have humanitarian capacity for the likes of explosive remnants of war removal, or demining activities. Humanitarian demining will often require resources that is not already identified, because perhaps the mission is in a position to provide that support already, albeit to the host government. What I think is important, though, moreover, is to recognise the area security elements that they support. And there was a lot of discussion on this yesterday, as we talked about, for those of you who managed to join the discussion with respect to escorts and the use of escorts, ensuring that there is proper route clearance, ensuring that there is area security support is something. Do the host government have the capacity? Does the host government, are they able to stand up and do this? And or how do we do it in areas which are controlled by non-state armed groups? And do we have the capacity and the interlocutors to engage with those? Because often there is perhaps an element of the mission negotiating with those and understanding that, but how is our humanitarian access and negotiation really working? Airports, seaports, that is something that the mission often ensures security of. And we all then tend to rely that if they're there in big numbers, that they're also helping on many other aspects around that. And I think for any organizations that are in Haiti or in Somalia, we all understand the support that is afforded there. But it's not just about the logistical support and safeguarding the logistic spaces that are in those locations. It's also, again, making sure that those routes for all our large scale logistics pipelines are supported. I think it goes, though, beyond the security aspects. Certainly for the UN agencies, we become quite dependent on the missions, particularly for air asset support, thinking of particularly for medical evacuation and CASEVAC, but also, again, for their level 1 to 4 medical support. We're often in remote locations. The only medical services that may be provided to us is that level 1 clinic. And when, of course, it comes to sustainability thereafter and moving, we're usually trying to move people to other bases where the mission can support. Another area, and particularly one that I see often as UNHCR, where we have camps set up, is the firefighting capacity that they sometimes have, where again, host governments don't necessarily have the capability or capacity, and we're often relying on the missions for that. And Another big area, I think, when it comes to security risk management measures that we tend to rely on them for is training facilities. So again, the SAFE training is a requirement in any of these settings. It's a requirement for again, it's the equivalent to the HEST. For those of you who may be online, it's a UN security training for staff operating in high-risk environments. But often the bases where we would run it would be facilities that are managed by the mission. And they would often lend the necessary support to do that. There's been some discussion already with respect to engagement with the communities, but I think that is also important to address that and embark early. And you asked about opportunities and what we should be doing to address some of these gaps. But I think it's where we as humanitarian agencies also need to embark in a timely manner with communities to help them understand, and moreover engaging, as I said already, with different groups, particularly non-state armed actors, that we are operating in these spaces and that they clearly understand who we are. Now, there's been a lot of discussion already this week and last week with respect to funding. And that, I think, is the biggest implication, is that within all of this, there is going to be a need for extra resources. If we all have to stand up on our own, we do need money and resources for this, and we have to budget accordingly. And that is something, of course, that we face challenges for. We also, of course, have to review our plans and, again, think of the different security situations that we're facing. And of course, business continuity relates to that. You know, from a practical perspective, in different places where we've already been involved in drawdowns, it often means that we've had to reassess our offices, reassess our locations of where we're based, and look at our footprint activities. That might not have been the idea when the proposal of the Security Council or the host government was there at the outset, but it might be a reality that we ultimately have to face and deal with. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Julie. A lot of very concrete examples that demonstrate the resource gaps, the capacity gaps that we face when these missions live, and how can we actually bridge that gaps if we can. Turning back to Valentin, how does the model in integrated settings lead to all these challenges, and what can we do about them?
Thank you. As you know, in speaking on security realm, the security arrangements in the mission are focused on the integrated security workforce framework, which in essence means that the most senior security professional deployed by UNDSS becomes the lead or the principal advisor to the head of mission and the SRSG, in addition to the designated official role. In integrated settings, in most cases, the rule is that the head of mission, SRSG, is as well the designated official for security for the UN wider system. And then it might not become that apparent, but the focus of the head of mission being the mission itself is not equal with the focus of the designated official that looks at the wider UN system. Some of the challenges that we see from this end in regards to the integrated settings, and starting from the beginning, is the temptation to establish an overinflated security apparatus for the mission. And there are good reasons for that, some not, perhaps less, but one of the drivers is the necessity or the looking ahead and hoping that those resources could be used beyond what is necessary for the implementation of mission mandates. And that creates from the get-go a state of tension, if I may describe it this way. Then that leads to the variance in interpretation when it comes to the role of the integrated security workforce. This integrated security workforce framework comprises security resources of the Secretariat only, not other UN organizations. So it's strictly confined by the Secretariat, or within the Secretariat, if you want, which in the field, in essence, translates of UNDSS and the security section of the mission, and that's why I'm referring to it only in this binom, if you will. So the security section of the mission continues to be there for serving the mission. That's why it is established through the budgetary processes and so on. While the UNDSS senior official in the form of the PSA or Principal Security Advisor or the Chief Security Advisor continues to have an overall UN wide role. So there is a dissonance there already. As a result of that, and because oftentimes a mission is, in terms of size, capacity, personnel, and so on, is bigger, if you will, than any other UN organization. I'm saying this as a generic. There are situations where things are not exactly this way, but in principle, because of that, and because of the fact that the SRSG or the head of mission is as well the designated official, the DSS structure or the PSA, CSA tend to be absorbed into the mission's works, which detracts and creates the image that the advice and the security posture directed by DSS or advised by DSS goes into too much towards the mission needs as opposed to UN agencies, funds, and programs. Apologies for the background. But then that leads to an over-reliance on missions, logistics, security facilities, other resources, infrastructure, equipment, you name it. But while on the mission side, it's seen as DSS being too much on the, bringing too much on the, humanitarian considerations and so on. So there's all sort of unbalance in there. So last but not least, this over-reliance leads to a gap that is formed after the departure of the mission. And then, I'll come perhaps later on and in the next module and discuss a bit on how this appears and why it is a constant that we see all the time. Thank you. Over.
Thank you, Valentin. We understand that the center of gravity, so to say, or the security management is really leaning very heavily towards the missions, and that's something that we'll need to address. Luc, turning back to you, are there any additional challenges that need to be factored in? There's been a lot that has been already talked about when planning for drawdowns and withdrawals, mission withdrawals from the perspective of humanitarian organizations. Over.
Yeah, thank you very much. And indeed, a lot has already been put on the table. And also for the sake of time and to give the audience an opportunity to ask some questions, I'm going to try to be as succinct as possible and not to be too repetitive, because a lot of what colleagues have said were also on my list to say. So there are actually a number of additional challenges that need to be factored in when planning for drawdowns and withdrawals. As already mentioned, there may be funding shortfalls, and especially in the current financial climate, that's actually something that always needs to be considered. which these shortfalls can actually affect the capacity to offer critical humanitarian assistance to beneficiaries. And this may create displacement, the outbreak of diseases, and insecurity, right? And the insecurity underscores the importance of updating the security risk management process on a regular basis, right? Because this will actually inform decision making. Transitions are, as already mentioned, complex processes that involve reconfiguring the UN's presence, strategy, and footprint in country. They require early and sustained collaboration among field missions, host governments, UN country teams, and the local actors and global actors, or regional and global partners. In this, it will be important to assess the readiness and feasibility to shoulder additional responsibilities and costs associated with services previously provided under the mission umbrella, and several of the colleagues already expanded on that. This includes ensuring that the UN country team is prepared to take over these responsibilities. And as Julie mentioned, we expect to lose significant UN security capacity from the missions, and the gaps will need to be filled efficiently with fewer security resources. This may be easy if the drawdown comes with an improved security environment, but this may not always be the case, right? We see it in DRC, Somalia, and other contexts. Successful transitions depend on building trust with the local community. This has been mentioned as well, and ensuring national ownership. Right, we need to rely on them, because with the drawdown of the mission, national ownership is crucial, and this involves engaging with local community and civil society and regional and sub-regional organizations, which has been mentioned already as well. Ensuring timely and effective information sharing and coordination among all stakeholders, including the host government, country team, humanitarian organization, is essential in managing the transition smoothly. Finally, there needs to be a thorough understanding of the implications of community perception and a need to address humanitarian access following the withdrawal of a UN mission. This involves adopting access negotiation strategies, community acceptance, and implementing partnership as important risk management measures. This is, I hope I wasn't too long, and I hand it back over to you.
Thank you very much, Luke. I'll almost ask the same question, but very quickly to both Emmanuel and Ben from the perspectives of UNDSS and INSO. Any other challenges and consequences actually of the withdrawals and transitions for the UN and for NGOs? Emmanuel first.
Yes, thank you. Well, I won't repeat what colleagues have said about the challenges of having several services not being available after the closure or the departure of the mission, but maybe just to focus on the politicization aspect of the transition. I mean, whether it's special political mission or peacekeeping operations, these are inherently political animals. And the transition process is also a very politicized event, and especially from the host states, and particularly when the mission closure is at the request of the host state. And one aspect that we have to be also very mindful about is that this politicization doesn't affect the rest of the UN in its capacity and the humanitarian partners in their capacity to deliver on the ground. To give you an example, in certain countries where we've had missions, so we usually have human rights division that is part of that mission, but the human rights mandate doesn't finish once the mission leaves. So there's a lot of negotiation that needs also to take place and to make sure that we can keep that capacity once the mission leaves. And that could be, for example, negotiating to open a country office for OHCHR. So, these are aspects also that we have to be mindful, but also making sure that then the colleagues doing that are not endangered, that we really manage that we make sure that they can manage to work on the ground without affecting their safety and security. And another aspect also related to the politics, let's say, it's missions usually come with very easy access to the higher level of power in a country, but also at the national and local. So it's at the national and at the local level. So once the mission leaves, it's also like, what is the capacity that the UN has to engage with national authorities, with local authorities, and particularly when it comes, for example, to mediate conflicts, or, to point out that, there's been an incident involving the UN and we would like that to be addressed. So we've talked about like the services that leave, especially the security related services that leave once the mission closes. But there are other aspects. I'm thinking, for example, legal advisors. You usually have a legal advisor when a mission is deployed. While if you don't have a mission, it could be a regional legal advisor. So you don't have that access immediately. And it's something that can be also quite a big loss when the mission departs. So I think these are some of the important aspects, like the capacity also to engage with the national and local authorities. And it is sometimes goes beyond just negotiating access. We have in certain cases the peace and development advisors, but they don't necessarily have like, the level or the authority that SRG or the SRG might have. So I think these are also important consequences that we have to take into account.
Yeah. Thank you, Emmanuel. I think we lost you a couple of times, but I think we understand pretty much your points regarding politicization of the process, that the link that is more or less changed, if not lost, when the SIHG is no longer there with their level of influence they may have on stakeholders locally, and also, of course, all the other services that we, Julie, Luke, and all the panel members have talked about a little bit, that is lost also. Very quickly, I just want to hear from Ben in so before moving to the opportunities, which is more important at the end of the day, that we can find in those moments. Ben, from the perspective of NGOs, what's your take there?
Yeah, I think I'd sort of pick up on two things that were alluded to and really echo them from the perspective of NGOs. I think the first thing, as I think Emmanuel really correctly pointed out, is on this issue of politicization. I think from the NGO perspective, it does feel a little bit like sometimes during the machinations of the negotiations about how the transition is going to go and, back and forward between a lot of different, quite often regional stakeholders, it feels like, the impetus for lobbying and representation when it comes to humanitarian access can be a little bit lost. Like that tends to slightly fall beside the wayside a little bit. Particularly in some of these contexts when government imposed access constraints are a problem for various reasons and in various ways. I think sometimes the specifics and the technicalities of the transition can sometimes overshadow some of these broader discussions about what humanitarian access looks like. And then I think finally, just to say, for NGOs, it is the number one thing in the context of a transition is how does this impact our access regime, right? Like what's our access? What is an NGO access regime during and post a transition? As I said before, this is really about, okay, what role does the international mission play currently in the access regime? How is that likely to change? And I think, in terms of a practical or operational point, and I think Luke mentioned this, information sharing is so critical, like within the wider humanitarian sector, like not obviously just within the NGOs, within the UN system, but within the wider humanitarian sector, simply because if there isn't clear information sharing about transition timelines with operational specifics, then it makes it very hard to do any form of access planning, any form of contingency planning. And that then impacts the broader landscape as well. So I think I sort of pick up on those 2 points. Thanks.
Thank you, Ben. Moving to the opportunities that arise for humanitarian organization in these complex times, and want to move to you and ask you, how important is it to have joint communication and inclusive involvement in the humanitarian community as a whole? I guess it's important for us for all the humanitarians to come together in those very difficult times. What's your take on these opportunities in terms of joint communication and inclusiveness from the humanitarian perspective? Over.
Yeah. Thanks very much. I think we've mentioned it. There are a couple of significant shifts in the way that we work, but these also present opportunities. From the humanitarian perspective, we've talked about the importance of access, those humanitarian negotiations. I think other colleagues have mentioned that programming will shift. So things that the mission does, like protection, like human rights, demining, mine risk education, these kinds of activities might move to other agencies. So what the humanitarian community is doing, where they need to do it, who they need to engage with, it's an opportunity to relook at that. And from a security perspective, how do we enable them to do that, right? In all of this changing political dynamics and all of these changing transitions with our own support and structures, how can we continue to enable during the transition and after? I think one, the HCT, the humanitarian country team, we spoke about it yesterday, the use of armed escorts. If we're using the mission, particularly peacekeeping missions for armed escorts, this is a great chance to relook at that and reassess if that's the right approach. Is it better to reinvest in negotiations and acceptance as a risk management strategy, for example? And that requires broad consultations, not just within the UN, but with our partners. Those decisions have significant implications for them. I think working together on the analysis, on the scenarios with access, civil military coordination, these have been mentioned. It's a huge opportunity to strengthen the country team connections and information sharing for the way forward post-mission. And from the security perspective, I think we just need to understand that in many cases, these transitions have been happening very rapidly. Things like engagement, humanitarian negotiations, these take time. So how we can manage these different timelines and approaches is really important to be communicating and working together so that we can get to the right decisions. Thanks. I'll pause there.
Thank you, Anne. Luke, you know those transitions has talked about.
Sorry, I can't hear you anymore. Hello, am I the only one?
Yes,
No,
Luke.
dropped out for me as well.
Can you hear us?
Yes, you're back.
Oh,
I was worried. Again, we can't hear you.
Now you're back.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, I didn't hear you, so...
Well, no, the question is, can mission transitions be an opportunity for humanitarian organizations? I know we have some connection issues, but we may want, I can put the question in the chat eventually.
No, I heard you. This time I heard you.
Perfect.
And it's, of course, an excellent question. And my answer would be yes, indeed. Transitions present a significant opportunity for humanitarian organizations. Several colleagues have already mentioned, but I would like to repeat a couple because they're important. So a transition really offer an opportunity to review the security management system in country to ensure effectiveness and efficiency gains, because every change management opportunity we should really seize, right? And this includes evaluating the necessity of certain security measures and exploring cost-effective and sustainable alternatives, for example, and Anne mentioned this, reducing the size of security escorts, finding more cost-effective alternatives for these escorts, and maybe look into, as several colleagues have already mentioned, community acceptance in view of some of the expensive measures, right? Another opportunity is that in a mission context where there was a requirement based on the security risk management process to have armored vehicles and communication infrastructure, which is very expensive, right? So often this can be purchased relatively cheap from the mission. And this can enhance the operational capacity of humanitarian organizations, at least if this would still be security risk management measures in the revised assessment, right? The risk management approach can shift from a protection model to an acceptance and enabling model, right? So I think this is important. Several colleagues have alluded to that. This means that while risks might increase in some areas, they could also decrease, right? But when the the mission leaves, just the mere fact that some of the parties of the conflict is leaving can actually change for the better security environment. I'm not saying always, I said it can. Transitions also provide an opportunity to strengthen partnerships, including with regional organizations and non-governmental organizations. And collaborative efforts can ensure a smooth transition and continued security and humanitarian support. A humanitarian organization can benefit from the improved perception of neutrality and acceptance within communities, as they are often seen as more civilian and neutral actors compared to peacekeeping missions. So by leveraging these opportunities, humanitarian organizations can indeed enhance their operational capacity, improve security measures, and strengthen their partnership. I hand it back over here. Thanks.
Thank you, Luke. So if I hear you well, there's a lot of work to be done, not only in terms of analysis, but also in
We can't hear you again.
Yes, now moving to Emmanuel, maybe from the perspective of UNDSS, if we talk about the resources and the resource gap that that we witness in those contexts, of course, there are often less resources that we know, but what can be done differently? There was a proverb saying, if there's no way, find a way, make one. So what can we do about those in these contexts? Emmanuel?
Yes, thank you. As you said, basically we have to make sure that everyone understands and that we're on the mindset that before the transition is not equal to after the transition. So the messaging is really that we have to review a bit the way that we're going to be working on the ground, that we don't have the capacities that we used to have when the mission was present. So that's, Luc mentioned it was also in terms of risk management, making sure that there is acceptance and things like that. So it's relates to reviewing a bit our program delivery methods. We have to see a bit, how it is possible to still deliver, but how to do it differently so that we don't get exposed in terms of the security of our staff. And there are other also opportunities, to look at efficiencies and pooling of resources. I'm not saying that, we don't already do that when the mission is present, but it is, the possibility to look at where we can be better situated to make sure that, again, we deliver the programs, not being focused on what used to be the mandate of the mission, but more if it's delivering humanitarian aid, being closer to these populations, or where we can have a better access to them, rather than being sometimes the missions are a bit more located on the basis of political, considerations or military or security considerations. So now we can try to see how we can also move and change a bit our footprint in that regard. There is also the possibilities to look at options to reduce our cost by pooling our resources, looking at the possibilities to have common premises. Looking at it from a security point of view, if you have several locations, several offices in town, it implies also having more security guards to protect all these premises. While if we can concentrate in one premise, it's easier also to provide security. There are other aspects also related to that, which can be, for example, in terms of procurement of protection equipments or other equipments that we can use that are also related to security. And then another aspect is also, especially when we don't have such a presence on the ground that we can have with missions, is looking at the possibility of, for example, regionalizing some of the security functions, whether it's having operation center, do we have the capacity to maintain it in the country, or would it be possible also to use a more regional capacity to do that? In terms of analysis also, do we need to have people strictly on the ground? How many? Can we have more done from a different location where they would analyze it also as part of a broader regional security analysis? Because also there are cases where the situation in the country is affected by regional dynamics. So it's also on issues like that that we have to see where we can concentrate our efforts and use less resources just by the fact that we don't have the same ones that we used to have when a mission is present.
Thank you, Emmanuel. I want to give the chance for the participants to also ask questions and for you to respond to those questions. But before that, I just want to ask to Ben, Emmanuel and Luc have all talked about partnership, but how important are international partnerships, including between the UN and regional organizations, NGOs, during these transit phases? What more can be done to strengthen this collaboration to ensure a more smooth transition and continued security for humanitarian actors? Over.
Yeah, thanks. I think really important. And I think there's also space for institutional innovation as well. So I think just sort of briefly give an anecdote, I guess. In Somalia, there's something called OTIS, which is the Operational Transformation Initiative Somalia. This is basically a collective working group that brings together UN donors and NGOs, co-chaired by INSO, and DSS is on it, etc. And we're sort of working across access, logistics, and security to understand the implications of the transition, and then jointly sharing recommendations, which will be passed to the HCT. The donors are involved, so there's like quite a collaborative process there about understanding what some of these risks are. Like INSO and DSS working together quite closely on that, sort of covering both the UN and the NGO side of the security, and sort of attempting to contribute to collective understanding and trying to figure out where are the gaps, what needs to be done in order to fill in some of those gaps. I think someone was talking
about Ben, we lost you at one point.
Oh, did you? Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Yeah, sorry. Not quite sure where you lost me, so I'll just carry on. I think there was talk of air assets earlier. I think in Somalia specifically, understanding what are the new UNHAS modalities, how's that going to work? And so I think that type of institutional innovation in terms of bringing together these working groups, I think can work out and be quite important. I think just the other thing I would mention is, for NGOs, particularly when it comes to evacuation planning, contingency planning, really clear communication about SLT provisions in certain areas. I think there's a gap in understanding for a lot of different NGOs about specifically what type of SLT provisions are there in each area, and also how do they then access those provisions. So I think NGOs is one of the things we say to them in terms of sharing updated lists of staff members and so on, but also as well, from the UN side in terms of making that information available. And one of the things which is coming out of this OTIS initiative is, we putting together an aid memoir on SLT in Somalia. So again, like that's one of the benefits that's coming out of this type of institutional innovation as well. So yeah, I think for NGOs, there's definitely a lot that can be done in terms of the institutional partnerships. Thanks.
Thank you, Ben. Before moving to questions, last one for Valentin. Looking at past transitions, given your experience with those, what are some of the key lessons learned that you can share? And are there any successful examples of transition processes that can offer insights into how future transition can be better managed?
Thank you. This is a very interesting area, and I think we are sort of lucky to be informed by recent transitions. And I'm thinking of Mali and Sudan, and that are already completed, and then some that are ongoing. As you know, UNAMI is in transition mode. The end of mission is projected for 31st of December this year, being followed by liquidation, 6 to 9 months of liquidation time. And then the mission in Somalia that is projected to cease operations later October next year. So some critical items that we observed during the transitions, and then I think it's worth mentioning that the two recent examples that I gave on Mali and Sudan were conducted at a very accelerated pace. The time given to the UN to wrap up operations and transition was counted in months, whereas normally a transition process takes, an actual transition process takes at least a year. So keeping that in mind, what we observed was disruption in the engagement with the host country, between the UN and host country. There is a deficit that had to be compensated, and catch up had to be run very quickly. That relates as well to diminished engagement through local diplomatic channels that would relate to engagement with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, other entities of the government. That's what I'm referring to, diplomatic channels. So that was an area of disruption as well. We noted significant gaps in respect to security arrangements, ability to deploy personnel in relation to security. I mean, security personnel to the to country to establish the new or to implement the new framework after mission's departure. That relates as well not only to personnel but to other equipment and everything else that comes into play. That's led to difficulties in running operations. One other aspect is, for example, related to the.
Yes, we didn't hear you the last. Yes, go ahead, please.
Okay, so I would want to add as well a number of security measures that relate to the protection of the most senior UN official, close protection arrangements that normally come when the mission is present, is captured within the mission assets, but once after the departure, new arrangements have to be made, provided that requirement for protection is still required. And then with the leadership reconfiguration, there are difficulties in establishing credible leadership for the continuation of the operations. And then last but not least, I think there's general agreement that the ability to conduct integrated analysis and planning to the extent where humanitarian development programs is a challenge, and then it still requires work in order to establish frameworks and then so on. I'll stop here in the interest of time. I think there are a couple of those were perhaps the most important items that I wanted to highlight for our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valentin. And apologies for the connection issues for those who are online. Just want to also give the chance for those who are in the room to ask questions if they do have. They may raise their hands. I think we have one question there.
Thank you so much, and to the panelists, really interesting interventions. My name's Lauren Phillips. I work with the UN Volunteers Programme. And I'm just interested if the panelists could speak a little bit more about that planning element for the transition to national or local counterparts kind of beyond the country teams. And for the context of that question, so with UNV, we have about 2,000 volunteers deployed in the peace operations, but a vast majority are deployed with the country teams, so about 10,000 with country teams. And so as the missions transition comes up, we always try to encourage and think about how we can plan for some of these international volunteer positions to become more national volunteers, with the kind of view of having some of them transfer, if possible, to the country teams, and then beyond that to national counterparts, whether that's the government or, if not appropriate there, in civil society, and really having that sustainability element embedded there. So interested in the panel's views about that. And of course, some of the security elements probably not appropriate, but for those security adjacent roles, whether it's public information, logistics, that sort of thing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't know who wants to take that question.
Maybe I could come in.
Valentin, yes, of course.
Thank you very much. And that's really a good question and has to do with, the works of the transition preparedness, but as well implementation. As I mentioned in my first intervention, there are essentially two tracks. One is related to engagement with the government, and in there, the transfer or identification of areas where the government still requires support and what's the form that the support is required, and then the resources that are needed, including human resources, if you will. And then the other track being the internal transformation of the UN, where those resources would have to be taken into account. And that takes place essentially in practical terms once the Secretary General's directive is signed off. That triggers a chain of a reaction chain, if you will, through which the pillars that are identified between the UN organizations and internally between the government and the UN are actually worked through, and then that leads to putting so-called meat on the bones resources around the requirements that are identified. I think, but it is fair to say, I would say, that the level of transitioning, the level of resources that are that would remain in place, including on personnel, including sort of repurposing personnel, are fairly low by comparison to the previous situation where the mission was present. I'm not sure how the UNV workforce, so to speak, and I apologize for using this term, is focused on humanitarian developments aspects of the UN work. But when it comes to missions, as far as I know, only a very limited capacity is identified by the government, including through nationalization of those resources. I hope I touch at least in part to the question. Thank you. Over.
Thank you. We have one question, and I hope it's okay for the response. We have one question in the chat, in the Q&A. If there's no other hand here, yeah, Bill, please.
So I'm very interested in the different mindset and different set of challenges and approach required after transition, but some of the people will be the same people who've stayed through the transition and to do it. I'm just interested in what advice you have on how to achieve mindset and cultural change to move from one stance to another in this context.
Thank you, Bill. Julie, or?
I will try and make a start because I think this is an important one for us all as we go through this process. So within UNHCR, we have tried to develop some specific guidance for our managers to help them with this process. So ensuring, of course, that the conversation begins well in advance. So as soon as we know about the drawdown, that they're also getting into the mindset and thinking, what does this mean for them? What does this mean for our respective operations? And trying to have that shift. It also means that, of course, we have to ensure that they're fully engaged with not just yourselves, UNDSS, but also the SMT, but moreover with the mission itself in terms of, again, thinking of the different clusters and, as we talked about earlier on, the other aspects. to think, how is this transition going to be? But we're focused specifically on security here. I think it also, again, recognises the necessity to ensure that it's our other structures within our organisation that are also engaged in it. So again, within UNHCR, we certainly talk to our colleagues, whether it is in supply, whether it's our medical teams, our psychosocial teams, again, trying to prepare and look at what this really means for us on the ground. So these are some of the colleagues we're involved with. And again, looking at assets that we may be offered, saying, is this something we want to take on? What are the implications of that? Do we need to go out and resource other assets ourselves? So again, looking at it really from the A to Z is so important. So that's what we're trying to help with respect to that. And of course, reviewing our security staffing structure. I think that is it. And we've already talked about that. That certainly was something that came out in some of the interventions already made. But again, looking at what it will look like for us in the future, what our operational footprint will look like, what we're going to be able to do, and then moreover, what will our mechanisms and support structures be to support that. Thanks.
Thank you, Julie. I don't know if the other panel members online want to add something.
Can I just jump in quickly to second the element of staff communication, but also involvement, right? This is an opportunity to shift. If we want new idea, opportunity for us to reach out and engage more with staff, get different ideas on different approaches, test things out, and provide that kind of leadership and vision for the way forward. Oftentimes we get stuck in what we're losing, what is changing, and not the opportunities that this presents. So communicating, working closely with staff, program colleagues, access colleagues, partners, and really kind of crowdsourcing the ideas so that we find innovative solutions that work for the team, and then test them out and engage with staff all the way through. Thanks.
Yeah, if I may comment here,
Sure.
just like for 30 seconds, I second everything that my colleagues have said. But one of the things I remember when I was in integrated peacekeeping missions was that, yes, after the transition, some of the people who were part of the integrated missions stay still post-transition. But some people may even have been there before the establishment of the integrated mission. And sometimes it's good to reflect on what was in place before the mission came in security arrangements, then what happened during, and what we actually need after. And I was once part of a discussion on it, and it was really refreshing. The people who had the history of what was in place before the mission and what worked, what didn't work, what changed during a transition and then after. I just wanted to add that because this can actually help in finding the ground under the feet and to be realistic and innovative in security risk management approaches. Thanks.
Thank you. Just one final question online from Marlies. The question is the following: there's been a push to make transition planning a more regular feature of UN integrated planning, and to start well in advance of decisions to draw down. How can humanitarian community, UNCT members, engage more effectively in integrated planning or mechanisms throughout the mission lifespan, including transitions, and ensure an effective bridge for non-UN humanitarians? I don't know if Emmanuel or Valentin, any one of you want to take that one?
Sure. I'm happy to have a first stab at it. Valentin can also complement. I think Valentin actually mentioned that at the very beginning, saying that transition is supposed to start from the very beginning of a mission, as soon as it is established. So we have also directed in that sense. For example, missions are supposed to already start transition calendar. It's actually a planning document also. They're supposed to start that, working on that very early on, even before there is actually a decision to do a transition or a drawdown of a mission. And this is supposed to be also a document where usually it's the DSRG RCHC that is on the lead with his office, his integrated office, where then they would be also able to bring in our humanitarian partners the UNCT, of course, and to discuss a bit and to identify, what are the benchmarks that need to be achieved. Again, coming back to the ideal scenario that emissions should be drawing down when we achieve some of our goals. So the idea with this transition calendar is to identify the benchmarks where it would be possible to gradually draw down the mission. Like, what are the functions or what are the mandates that used to be done by the mission, and, whether we have reached a sufficient level where now part of the work can be undertaken by our UNCT colleagues, by our humanitarian partners and all that. And in that regard also, there are other avenues where we can discuss that, where we can make sure that there is work that is aligned, whether it's in terms of joint programming, taking part also in PMT, so program management teams, just making sure also that we are actually coordinated in our work so that it eases the process of the transition, that we already have a well-established collaboration, and that everyone on both sides, whether it's on the mission side or on the country team or even on the humanitarian partners, that they understand that it's okay. We have managed to reach a point where it's possible also to hand over basically some of the work, or making sure that other partners are able to continue the remaining work. Going back also to the question raised earlier about the nationalization of posts, that some functions can be also then undertaken by some of the national authorities, the ministries and things like that, with then a negotiated kind of support from the UN that would stay in country. So I think that's some of these aspects.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Just want to give you the chance for 30 seconds for each one of you, started by Ben. What's your final words? What do you want the participant to take away from your perspective? Over.
Yeah, thanks. I actually just sort of wanted, in my final reflections, I think just to sort of mention something or propose something, which is that, at least, coming from an Africa perspective, obviously where we're seeing a lot of these types of missions, is that we're sort of really moving towards a different model. We saw with the resolution 2719 in December, which allows for the use of UN assessed contributions to fund African Union peace support operations. That's looking to be the model for the mission in Somalia going forward. There's obviously talks about where else it could be applied. And I just think it's worth us reflecting on that, as, this, I think, at least to me, seems likely to be the model going forward that's used. In effect, this sort of subcontracting down to the regional level. I think this could exacerbate some of these problems that we talked about, could also be used as an opportunity in other areas as well. So I think, I just encourage participants and audience members to reflect on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Valentin?
Thank you very much. I think if I would want to encapsulate in a few words, I think we have, or the UN as a whole has a framework in which it operates, but the most critical thing is the cooperation and coordination between various entities, and that coordination work should start very, very quickly, very early in the process, and not with the view of taking advantage of one another. Oftentimes we see a competitive approach, if I have to be blunt and honest, but it should be more on a cooperative engagement through which the system transforms itself in a new era after the mission's departure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Over.
Thank you. Luc?
Okay, I know we're running out of time. Maybe my pitch is on the challenges to adequately prepare the country team for a smooth humanitarian development operations post-transition. Early and integrated planning it needs to be institutionalized in policy. On the knowledge sharing or transfer, the mission usually has a strong understanding of the political dynamics. Thus, some of this capacity and expertise can be temporarily retained by the country team to advise and guide the country team. On opportunities, downsizing missions are often willing to sell or give away some of their assets. For instance, in Iraq, UNAMI plans to offer access control equipment free of charge. They also have generators, armored vehicles, radio equipment, etc. On efficiency gains, the UN Guard units and security escorts are often very expensive, and other approaches could be considered, including private security companies or host government security forces. The need modality of the radio rooms should also be investigated. And lastly, and I think very important, community acceptance and modality for access should be explored as a risk management measures. And through all of this, we should never forget that everything will be informed by the security risk management process. That would be my pitch. Thanks.
Thank you, Luc. Thank you. We're over time already. Just want to have also Anne, Julie, and Emmanuel say the words very quickly. Anne?
Thanks, Gabriel. 3 points from my side. The collaboration on the security side, that security cell working with our SLT partners and the security management team really need to work together. It's a time for innovation, right? Moving from that protection mindset to enable to an acceptance mindset to enable. It's a great opportunity for that. And then finally, I take Bill's point that it's also for leaders, it's about change management, right? How do we manage the change with our staff, with our colleagues, and with our partners? Thank you.
Thank you. Julie?
Thanks, Gabriel. Yeah, I think it's a great opportunity to recalibrate security overall and to seize opportunities to work with the host government, to, of course, work with local partners, and moreover, the local community that we're there to support in the first instance.
Thank you. Thank you, Julie. Last but not least, Emmanuel.
Yes, thank you. Just to mention very quickly, one of the challenges, that remains is also we need to make sure that we work together with everyone, that we get the information from everyone from a security perspective, knowing, for example, how the next footprints of the UN will be. It is very important, and we need to have that information as early as possible. So I think, that's an important challenge also that we need to mention. But then, just to echo also what Anne has said, it's also an opportunity to rethink the way that we are actually on the ground and how we are delivering, moving toward acceptance and all that. So we have to take that into account. Also, it's a possibility for us to rethink the way that we're delivering our programs and all that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, esteemed panel members. This is a very interesting subject you have dealt with. Thank you very much for your insights, and for the participants also for having been here, despite the over time also. Thank you, and looking forward to seeing you, talking to you for your presence in next panels at the HNPW and also after this event. Thank you again. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks a lot.